Welcome back. Well, we just recapped the past 5 years of the USD-NDSU border battle, and joining me to talk a little more about those games and the weekend ahead, it's Brian Shawn up in West Fargo, and right here in Sioux Falls, Jay Elsen. These two have been at all 5 of those past games, and this discussion is brought to you by Grand Falls Casino and Golf Resort. So, Shawn, this series wasn't much of a series in 2012 to 2014. Talk about the dominance of the Bison in those years.
You know, I just think North Dakota State had a jump start on the whole Division I thing. You know, when South Dakota State and North Dakota State, they went through their trials and tribulations, and then South Dakota, North Dakota came later, and I just think it took USD a while to catch up from a talent perspective. I mean, those teams that NDSU had back in those days were so good in 2011, 2012, 2013, and USD just wasn't caught up yet. They didn't have the depth. They did have some good athletes, but it just wasn't in that situation. But South Dakota, I think, has done a nice job catching up in recent years. But the Bison, I think, most importantly, controlled the lines of scrimmage, had better athletes from top to bottom during those years. And frankly, NDSU had better athletes and better men up front than pretty much any other teams did during those years as well. So I think that was the dominance early on, and now it's really caught up.
Yeah, I definitely agree. In these past 5 years, that was my tenure in college, so I got to witness all of these from a student perspective. But Jay, the highlight of this rivalry from a Coyote side was obviously 2015, the upset in the Fargo Dome. You were there.
Yeah.
What do you remember most about that big win?
Well, honestly, it has a lot to do with what Brian was just talking about. I remember the feeling going into that game and how I thought it was going to go very similarly to what those first 3 games had gone in the series since that rivalry had resumed. I just didn't have a good feeling going in, and then when the Bison jumped out to that 14-0 lead, I really started to not feel very good about it. But then the second quarter starts, totally different game. And what Brian talked about, that line of scrimmage, how important that was. Mm-hmm. The Coyotes started to dominate the line of scrimmage on both sides of the football in that game, and then all of a sudden they're in the game at halftime. They're down 21-14. Then it's they go to the fourth quarter, and they get a chance to tie it up. They do it, and then Miles Bergner, of course, hits the shot heard round Fargo. First win for USD in Fargo since 1978. It snapped the Bison's 26-game winning streak at home, and it also snapped the Coyotes' 14-game conference losing streak. So all kinds of things came down on that day. But what an afternoon. And really, to this point, as a member of the Missouri Valley Football Conference, as a Division I program, that's where the bar has been set for USD. That's their biggest win to this point.
Yeah, I feel like we could hear Joe Van Gore's radio broadcast from Vermillion when that kick went through. But this question's for both of you. So in the past couple of years, obviously, this has become much more of a competitive rivalry. And looking at that, considering that competition, how do USD and NDSU see this now in the current situation with the teams being closer?
Well, I think from my standpoint, I just think, like I had mentioned earlier, South Dakota's just caught up. I mean, you're looking at the prolific offense that they've been able to build with a player like Chris Streveler and adding some other important pieces on the offensive and defensive lines. I think that's when Bob Nielsen came in here, said we just have to get much bigger and more physical up front. And I think the Yotes have done that, and that's why they've been able to hold in and have a lot of tackles for loss and a lot of sacks. They're pretty explosive in a lot of areas. And, I think that's been the blueprint for success. That's what Nielsen did at Western Illinois. He's done similar things at South Dakota. And I think it's fun to see how these two programs have really been lifted up to the point now where they're battling for a conference title in November. And I think that's pretty exciting. And that takes this rivalry to a whole nother level. Just because USD has not been in the playoffs before. They don't have the history with North Dakota State playing in the FCS playoffs on big stages. But I think those matchups are coming down the road because we've seen what USD's been able to do here, in particular this season.
Yeah, I think, Brian's absolutely right. I think it's, they say it's not a rivalry until the other team wins a game. Well, USD has done that, and they haven't done that against South Dakota State. And so there's some skepticism there. I still think overall, from a broader perspective, North Dakota State fans, USD fans, they're not really sure what to make of it just yet because the sample size is so small. And I think NDSU had moved on and had different rivals, you and I, SDSU, for a longer time at this level than what they've had with South Dakota. But they're not going to be able to think about it for much longer that way if these games continue to be competitive to the point that they have. And I think that's good for both programs. I think it's good for the league and just FCS football in general. The more rivalries you have, the more excitement that's going to be generated, and I think it's a great thing to see South Dakota closing that gap. Are they to that level yet? No, they're not, but they're getting closer. And to be in this conversation in November with a chance, if you go up to Fargo and you knock off NDSU and then you beat SDSU next week, you know, you get a share of the conference title. And that'd be a huge deal for this program.
Yeah, a huge jump. And, you know, you guys literally just talked about it, but USD's catching up. I mean, you look at them even from last year to this year, lost by a touchdown in Vermillion, the final game of the year, and now heading into this one, North Dakota State coming off the Dakota Marker loss, USD coming off the tough loss at UNI, and all of a sudden, you know, you're looking at the playoff perspective. There's a lot more to play for heading into Fargo on Saturday. So looking at that matchup, what are keys to this game coming up in the Fargo Dome on Saturday, Shawn?
Well, I think the key for South Dakota is to have a fast start. Try to take the crowd out of the game right away, and I think that's always a big key when you get to Fargo. South Dakota loves to go so quick, that if you keep NDSU on their heels and generate some rhythm and momentum, then that's something I think you can carry on. You know, when we see teams get buried in the Fargo Dome, it's a key turnover, a key penalty, they get backed up behind the chains, and then North Dakota State all of a sudden gets that momentum, gets the crowd behind them, and they can take full advantage of that. So I think that's going to be the big key in this game. And, you know, when you talk about USD catching up, you know, catching up is beating NDSU not only in the game but also in the conference championships. I mean, if NDSU wins on Saturday, they win a share of the conference title in the Missouri Valley for the 7th straight year. You know, I mean, that's only been done one other time by Northern Iowa in the 90s. So, I mean, this is obviously a huge game for both programs, looking ahead to not only here in November, but also into December as well.
I think if you, just adding to what Brian said about getting off to a fast start, USD has been very good in that department. They've had a lot of success, particularly in the first half of games this season. So if they do that, yeah, that's going to be great for them. I also think it puts North Dakota State in a position where, just like we saw last week against SDSU, it's just a program that's not used to having to play from behind a whole lot. Yeah. Not to say they're not capable of getting the job done, but they're not really built to do that. And if you get a 2-score lead, it's a little tougher for them. And so you put them in a tougher spot. But I think for me, absolutely the biggest key in this game for South Dakota is they have to play cleaner football. Yeah. The last 2 road games that they've lost at Illinois State and at UNI, they've turned the football over 6 times. They've only generated 2 takeaways, so they're -4 in the turnover margin. They've been outscored 20-0 off of turnovers. And so for me, it comes down to that. You cannot give the Bison extra opportunities in their building or things could get ugly.
Yeah, you get 2 teams, 2 great programs like this, and you make one mistake and that other team is going to take advantage of it right away. So needless to say, guys, looking forward to Saturday in the Fargo Dome. Thank you so much. All right, well, coming up next, we hear from Shawn yet again in this week's Bison Breakdown, featuring former Bison defensive lineman Pierre G. Tucker. Stay right here.